By the time the new VP laughed at me, I'd been running the grid in that city so long I could feel the peaks and valleys of demand in my bones. 23 years of watching power usage like a cardiogram, 23 summers of praying transformers held through heat waves, 23 winters of rerouting load when a substation coughed in an ice storm. The company called itself Metrolite Energy Management, which sounded clean and modern on the glass in the lobby. Inside, it was old carpet, worn cubicles, and a control room that smelled like stale air, cold coffee, and the nervous sweat of people who understood that if they got something wrong, a whole neighborhood would go dark. The office coffee tasted like punishment. We had a big industrial brewer in the break room, the kind with a metal belly and two hot plates that never shut off. Someone poured in cheap grounds by the fistful every morning at 6 and let it bake. By the time I got my first cup at 6:30, the stuff was the color of crude oil and tasted like battery acid had been stirred into a mud puddle. It scraped across my tongue, bitter and metallic, leaving a film on my teeth that never quite went away. We joked that if you could drink Metrolite coffee, you didn't need PPE. It had already burned away anything fragile inside you. The control room sat behind two badge readers and a heavy door that never quite closed right. Step inside and the smell changed. The air was cooler, dried out by overworked HVAC, with that faint electric tang I could pick up in my sleep, ozone and hot plastic, the smell of racks of equipment humming away in closets behind the walls. The big video wall at the front showed the city as a grid of lines and circles, transmission lines, substations, feeders, ties. Each blink, each color shift meant something: load going up, breaker open, transformer warming. I'd watched that wall for so long that the patterns had become a second language. I knew the city's heartbeat. I watched it through storms, concerts, playoffs, heat waves. When people flipped on their AC, when they made coffee, when they turned on the 11 o'clock news, I saw it. My badge said Senior Grid Scheduler, which in Metrolite's org chart translated to woman in the corner we call when we're scared. Officially, I was responsible for day-ahead and real-time scheduling on our section of the Regional Transmission Organization. In practice, I was the person who told dispatch, we can't pull another megawatt through that feeder without cooking it. Or, if we lose this substation, we must drop that industrial load first or we blow the whole east side. Everyone called it the grid like it was a single thing. It was a patchwork of old and new held together with SCADA and hope. The kill switch in that patchwork was nothing glamorous. It was a key in my desk and a password in my head. 13 years ago, after a storm knocked out 3 substations in one night and we almost lost the downtown loop, our insurer and the state regulators demanded additional independent safeguards on our loadshed system. We'd always had automatic schemes that kicked in when frequency dropped, but they wanted something else: a manual override that could disconnect large blocks of discretionary load in one stroke, even if the normal automation was too slow or too cautious. We built what we called the Grid Emergency Override Panel, or GEOP. It was a small console in a locked cabinet in the control room with hardwired lines to SCADA and a row of old-fashioned toggle switches. Each switch mapped to a loadshed block certain feeder groups, industrial customers who'd signed interruptible agreements, municipal systems that weren't life safety critical. Behind those switches sat logic in the SCADA master, but the control for energizing that logic came down to one physical key and one passphrase. Regulators insisted that the override only be accessible to an independent scheduler with at least 10 years' experience, separate from operations, signed off in our emergency operating procedures. That ended up being me. My name was on the policy. The physical key for the GEOP cabinet sat on my keyring, a dinged brass thing with a red plastic cap. The passphrase that armed the panel was one only I and the director of operations knew, and he retired 7 years ago. He'd written his copy on a piece of paper and handed it to me on his last day. I shredded it 10 minutes later. The policy said the passphrase had to be memorized, not written. We told auditors we complied. We did. It lived in my head, part of the constant low-level hum of numbers and patterns I carried around. I never liked the override. It wasn't elegant, it was blunt. Flip the right combination of switches and you could darken an entire quadrant of the city in under 30 seconds. But when the frequency sags and the automatic schemes don't trip fast enough, blunt saves equipment and sometimes lives. The GEOP was there for the 1 in 20 years event. The kind you hope you never see. I had my hand on that cabinet handle 3 times in 13 years. The public never knew. They saw, at worst, a flicker or a street or two out for an hour. They didn't see what we kept from happening behind the wall. The new VP arrived in early spring and treated all of that like set dressing for her slide deck. Her name was Kendra, but she insisted everyone call her Ken. She was in her mid-30s, an MBA with a specialization in energy markets and strategy, which, near as I could tell, meant she'd spent 2 years making models where nothing ever caught fire. She came from a consulting firm famous for advising utilities on how to unlock shareholder value. She wore sharp charcoal suits, silk blouses, and those pointed flats that look expensive but practical if you've never stood a 12-hour shift in a control room. No socks, of course, bare ankles above designer shoes, because nobody who's dressed for real work leaves their ankles that exposed. Her accessories were subtle and expensive: a thin gold watch, a leather folio, hair in a sleek knot that never seemed to move. On her first day, she called us together in the big conference room, the one with the bad speakerphone and the water-stained ceiling tile. The room smelled like old coffee and binder dust. She plugged in her laptop's silver, thin consultant's logo sticker still half peeling on the lid and brought up her deck. It had a name, Grid 2, from reliability to velocity. I remember that because I almost laughed out loud. She talked about synergy between operations and markets, about increasing velocity in decision-making, and pivoting from a risk avoidance mindset to an opportunity capture mindset. She used optics twice in one sentence when she explained why reliability outages hurt brand trust. She did not once say transformer, breaker, or SCADA. I watched the faces of the guys from maintenance and transmission sag as she spoke. They knew, the way I did, that she'd never spent a night in a bucket truck or sat in the control room at 3 a.m. with a storm crawling across the radar. For her, the grid was an abstraction, a line on a chart. After the meeting, she made a point of doing a little listening tour. That's what the email called it. She came into the control room in her suit and flats, clutching her folio like it might protect her from the smell of ozone and stale coffee. She shook my hand, introduced herself as Ken, and said she'd heard so much about me. Her tone was just this side of sincere. She stood behind my chair as I watched the midday peak start to build, eyes flicking over the displays like she knew what she was looking at. "It's quiet," she said. "Quieter than I expected." I told her that's how you want it. A noisy control room means you're already behind. She gestured at the GEOP cabinet on the side wall, beige metal with a worn red sticker that said "Authorized Personnel Only." "What's that?" she asked. I told her it was the emergency override. She laughed. "You mean the big red button?" she said. "I thought that was a myth." I opened the cabinet enough for her to see the panel rows of labeled switches, a black keypad, a small green indicator light, no red button. Reality is never as cinematic as people think. I explained briefly what it did and when we'd used it. I mentioned the regulator requirement about independent scheduling control, my name on the policy. She made a face like she'd eaten something too spicy. "That's insanely centralized," she said. "We're in 2024, we shouldn't have single points of failure like that. The system should just reroute itself." "We'll have to digitize this," she said, tapping the cabinet door with a manicured nail. "We can't have the city's resilience dependent on one person with a key." And the only person on shift was a junior who'd never seen a frequency excursion outside a simulation. Instead, I nodded and went back to watching the load curve. The war between her PowerPoint and my reality escalated quickly. She hated how manual our procedures were. She hated that we had paper binders for black start, load shed, cold weather operations. She wanted everything in the platform. "Platforms don't panic," she said in one ops meeting. "People do." I told her platforms are built by people who remember what panic feels like and code accordingly. She didn't appreciate the distinction. She started talking about automating away low-value work. To her, that meant the human eyeballs staring at screens in the control room. She'd read one too many vendor case studies about AI-assisted dispatch and self-healing grids. She brought in a startup with a name like GridSight, kids in hoodies who talked fast and showed her simulations. Their system, they promised, could optimize switching, predict overloads, and autonomously reconfigure around faults. They talked about velocity and resilience and unlocking capacity the humans are too conservative to see. They never once mentioned real-time phaser measurements or the risk of protection miscoordination. When they demoed their software on one of the side screens in the control room, she stood behind me and said in front of my entire team, "See, this is what I mean. The quiet grid scheduler becomes just a supervisor. The machine does the grunt work." The guys laughed awkwardly. I didn't. Quiet to me was a compliment. It meant nothing was on fire. I didn't sabotage her pet project. I annotated it. I wrote risk reports, carefully worded, explaining where automation could help and where it absolutely could not. I highlighted the consent decree we were under from a storm-related outage 15 years ago, 3 neighborhoods in the dark for almost a day, that spelled out our obligations to maintain certain manual controls. I pointed to the clause about the GEOP that any change to its operation or access controls had to be approved by the regulator and tested under supervision. She skimmed the memo. I know she did because she called my tone alarmist in a comment bubble and then sent it back with "Please be solution-oriented. Keep the humans in the loop, especially for anything beyond flipping a sectionalizer. Leave the GEOP alone unless and until the state blessed a new approach." But "in the loop" doesn't sound good in a pitch to the board. Fully automated AI-driven resilience does, so she went with that. They changed my job title before they changed my pay, from senior grid scheduler to real-time optimization advisor. The responsibilities were murkier. One day I was training the AI with historical events, feeding it what we'd done and why. The next I was being left off meetings where they discussed de-risking key person dependencies. In those meetings, I later learned my name came up more than once as the dependency they wanted to erase. The call came on a Thursday afternoon when the sky outside was the washed-out color of computer screens after midnight, even though it was barely 3. "HR's number. Can you come down for a quick chat?" they asked. Quick chat means they've already printed your paperwork. The HR manager's office smelled like potpourri and cheap hand sanitizer. Kendra was there, sitting in the guest chair like she was slumming it. She'd taken off her blazer, revealing a silk blouse with tiny geometric patterns, and crossed her bare ankles neatly under the chair. HR read from the script: organizational realignment, strategic shifting of resources, no reflection on your performance. Kendra added her own flourishes. She talked about how automation had changed the nature of real-time operations, how the GridSight platform would be handling the bulk of the dispatch logic. My role, she said, was no longer aligned with the future state. She called me an important part of Metrolight's history, which is corporate for "we've already deleted your account." "The what?" HR asked. Kendra recovered first. "We're decommissioning that dinosaur," she said. "It is moving everything into the new platform. Manual panels are a cyber risk." I told her regulators might disagree, that the state's last audit report had explicitly praised our independent manual override as a safeguard. She waved a hand. "We'll handle the optics," she said. Regulators are as excited about modernization as we are. When they slid a paper across the desk that would have had me certify that all access credentials and keys associated with emergency grid operations had been transferred or rendered inoperable, I left it blank. I handed over my badge. I did not hand over the GEOP key on my ring. No one asked for it. Why would they? In their minds, the panel was a dinosaur headed for extinction. They'd already moved on. They walked me out the back way as if the sight of me carrying a box might demoralize the younger staff. The control room door, as I passed, was propped open with a trash can. Inside, I could see the GridSight interface glowing on one of the big screens, colors a little too bright, contours a little too smooth. The old GEOP cabinet was closed, the red sticker still peeling at the corners. My chair was already empty. Someone had put a potted plant on my old desk. Things grow fast in fluorescent light if you water them with denial. I went home with my box, a couple of binders, my mug, a beat-up copy of the operating manual from the storm 15 years ago with my notes in the margins. I also had my keyring. The GEOP key sat there, heavy and indifferent. That night I took it off the ring and slid it into a small black box with a USB drive and a folded copy of the emergency operating procedures. The USB held copies of the policies that named me specifically as the independent GEOP operator and the regulator letters praising that setup. Paper and plastic, the only kill switches that matter in a system built on rules. 2 weeks later, the city hit its first real heat wave of the year. You learn the smell of heat in a control room. It's different from the outside. Outside it's hot pavement and car exhaust and whatever the river is giving off. Inside it's dry air, recycled a few times too many, the faint tang of hot transformers in the relay rooms and the smell of stress on people's skin. The forecast said triple digits for 3 days straight. Load projections climbed. Air conditioners would run nonstop. Older transformers already loaded near the edge would sweat. In my apartment, 3 subway stops away, I heard the weather report on the radio and knew, without seeing the wall, exactly where the weak spots would be. On day 1 of the heat wave, they kept it together. The automatic schemes handled the usual hiccups. They did some preemptive switching. GridSight earned its keep in little ways, flagged a feeder over its thermal limit, suggested a transfer, nothing heroic. On day 2, the city didn't cool off overnight. The concrete kept its heat and gave it back like a grudge. Load didn't drop the way it should. The lines sagged a little more. The indices in the SCADA masters ticked up toward thresholds. On day 3, something broke. I got the first hint not from the news but from a text from an old colleague still on the night shift. "This thing is blind," she wrote. "Heatwave plus an industrial trip." AI says hold, feels wrong. She sent a photo from the control room, the GridSight screen showing pretty green flows, the SCADA screen next to it with a line segment flashing yellow. One of the big substations feeding the West Side Industrial District had lost a transformer. They were running on N0 with an N1 design. You don't do that for long in that heat without rolling the dice. I texted back, "What did Ken say?" A minute passed. "She told us to trust the platform," my friend wrote. "Says manual overrides create confusion." She locked out manual switching for now. That took my breath away more than the heat. Locking out manual switching in a stressed grid is like locking the steering wheel when you hit ice. You don't get more control, you get a tidy crash. I didn't rush to the rescue. I wasn't employed. I was a citizen now. I poured myself coffee that actually tasted like coffee and tried to let someone else carry the weight for once. But the hum in the back of my mind wouldn't quiet. I'd spent half my life watching load curves in that city. I knew what a failure at that substation on that day would cascade into. The blackout started on the west side around 2:17 p.m. Substation 12 tripped, as it should, when a second transformer hit overload. The automatic schemes tried to pick up load on parallel feeders. They were already near the edge. Breakers opened. GridSight, with its smooth models, suggested a reconfiguration that ignored a subtle issue known only to people who'd sat through the postmortems from 15 years ago. A particular tie line had a miscoordination risk with a certain feeder if loaded that way. The AI called it non-binding, the physical world called it boom. Traffic lights died, elevators stopped. People in high-rises opened windows that didn't open. The city's noise dropped in volume, then rose again in sirens. I watched it unfold online. Social media filled with photos of darkened offices, stores, people standing on sidewalks staring at the dead towers. The utility's Twitter account posted a bland "We're aware of an outage and are investigating." The news stations rolled B-roll of sweaty anchors and blinking grid maps. They didn't know yet that the sequence had been made possible by someone trusting a system that didn't know the old ghosts. 3 hours in, my phone rang, not my cell, the landline I kept mostly out of nostalgia. Only a handful of people had that number. This time it was the CEO. He'd been a mid-level finance guy when I started, the kind who wore short-sleeve shirts with ties and carried a calculator. Now he wore suits and carried everyone's fear. His voice sounded frayed. He said the word mess 3 times in as many sentences. He said regulator twice. He did not say Kendra. He asked if I was following what's happening. I said I was. He asked if I would come in just to help us assess. We can set you up as a consultant. There was a strain on the word, like it hurt him physically to admit we'd reached that point. I named my price. $10,000 an hour, $200,000 retainer wired before I stepped into the building, indemnity if things got worse, written acknowledgement that I'd previously raised concerns about decommissioning the GEOP and about over-reliance on the new automation. He didn't haggle. Sirens were howling outside his window. He had bigger problems than my rate. By the time the wire hit, the blackout had entered its 4th hour. Hospitals were on generators. The transit system was limping. The mayor was on TV trying to look calm. I walked through Metrolite's lobby with a visitor badge clipped to my shirt instead of my old ID. The air smelled like too many bodies and not enough ventilation. The break room coffee machine was still on, dark liquid baking in the pot. I took a cup out of habit, tasted that same battery acid sludge, and let the familiarity steal my nerves. The control room was a war zone. People everywhere, some standing, some sitting, some on phones with field crews. The big wall that used to be green with flowing lines was a mess of red and gray. Lines out, breakers open, voltage sags. In the corner, the grid site interface blinked blandly, still trying to suggest optimal reconfiguration moves that the operators had long since stopped trusting. Kendra stood near the back, blazer off, blouse damp at the collar, talking into a headset, one hand pressed to her temple as if she could hold the crisis in by pinching hard enough. She saw me, and for a second something like hope flickered across her face. Then pride reasserted itself. "We've got this under control," she said loudly, more for the room than for me. The wall disagreed. The GEOP cabinet was where it had always been, beige and patient. For all her talk of decommissioning, they hadn't actually pulled it out. It takes more work to physically change things than it does to move boxes on a slide. Bureaucratic inertia had saved the city. The cabinet door was closed, the red sticker still peeling. I walked over and rested my hand on the handle. "Do you still have the key?" the CEO asked quietly behind me. I pulled out my little black box, opened it, and took out the brass key with the red cap. "You never asked for it back," I said. "We didn't flip the whole city off. That's not what overrides are for. We used the GEOP the way it was built to be used, surgically, ruthlessly, with human judgment." I opened the cabinet, punched in the passphrase my fingers had never forgotten, and watched the green, armed light flick on. Then I started shedding load. We targeted the interruptible industrials first, the big users who'd signed contracts agreeing to be cut off in emergencies. Some of them were already out. The few still hanging on went dark, their giant motors spooling down. We dropped certain municipal pumps and fountains, everything cosmetic that wasn't tied to basic services. Then, with the SCADA lead and transmission supervisor at my side, we cut sections of the West Side Commercial District that had redundancy through another loop, forcing load to reroute in a pattern the automatic system hadn't found, because it had never been told about the physical change in a tie line protection scheme we'd made years ago. Each switch flipped on the GEOP corresponded to a real change in the city, a block losing power, another stabilizing, a transformer cooling instead of heating. We watched the frequency and voltage respond. Slowly, block by block, the grid stopped swinging and settled into a new, ugly but survivable configuration. Lights came back on downtown. The East Side subway powered up. The blackout shrank from half the city to a few stubborn pockets where equipment was actually damaged. It took 8 hours before the mayor stopped saying "unprecedented" on TV. It would take weeks before the regulators finished asking their questions and the newspapers stopped running op-eds about grid modernization gone wrong. It took 2 days before the CEO called me into his office, my old director's office, and told me, eyes tired, that Kendra had decided to pursue opportunities elsewhere. That's corporate for. We threw her under the bus and then backed over her deck. They wanted me on retainer to advise on control room modernization and regulatory relations. I kept the rate, I kept my independence. I insisted on one more thing: the GEOP design would stay with proper succession. We'd train 2 more schedulers on the passphrase, get them written into the emergency procedures, and get the change blessed by the regulator. The key would become a symbol again, not a secret. I wasn't going to be the single point of failure she'd accused me of being. The machine needed more than one person who understood where the real levers were. People asked me quietly in the weeks that followed if I'd done it on purpose. If I'd held the key back so the system would fail. I told them no. The system failed because someone who didn't understand it decided image mattered more than redundancy and erased the one person who did. All I did was show up when the machine screamed for the operator it had been designed around, and invoice accordingly. The city moved on, it always does. People forgot the details and remembered only that there was a blackout one summer and some VP left afterward. Metrolite's press releases talked a lot about lessons learned and embracing human-machine partnership. The GridSight vendor quietly updated their marketing to emphasize operator-in-the-loop resilience. Someone in marketing suggested we put my face in a case study. I declined. I still sit in that control room a few days a week now as external consultant grid operations. The label on my badge is different. The smell is the same: ozone, old coffee, fear diluted with routine. I still drink the sludge even though my own kitchen has beans ground fresh every morning. Habit is as powerful as inertia. The GEOP cabinet still hums quietly on the wall, locked key on a chain around my neck when I'm on shift. The new VP laughed at the quiet grid scheduler because she couldn't hear the city humming in the silence. My override didn't just silence an entire city. It prevented a much uglier silence that comes when equipment dies and people get hurt. And for the first time in my career, when the machine needed my hand on the lever, it had to pay the rate that hand deserved.